welcome to Dialogue. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung made history by choosing Japan, not the U.S., for his first overseas visit as the president. He later met U.S. leaders in Washington as the debates heating up over the future of U.S. forces in Korea, from their strategic flexibility to President Trump's request to own the land where U.S. forces are stationed. What did President Lee achieve in Tokyo and Washington? How different is his approach from his predecessors? And could the mission of U.S. forces in Korea be redefined in the process? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Einar Tangen, political and economic affairs commentator, Sung-Yoon Lee, principal fellow at Sejong Institute, and Professor Robert Kelly at Department of Political Science of Pusan National University. Welcome to the show. So we'll start with Mr. Lee. So what's your take of President Lee's tour to Japan, Washington? What's the general view of the public inside Korea?
Well, I think the consensus, maybe minority consensus, is that both the summit with the Japanese leader and with President Trump within 2 days of one another were a success. This is sort of an international debut on the world stage for President Lee. He has been in office for less than 3 months, and I think he did a very good job in stressing what is important, that is cooperation and partnership with Japan across all kinds of things, not only economic cooperation, but also perhaps even political and military cooperation. And he took that message to Donald Trump. And despite this bizarre post by President Trump 2 or 3 hours before the summit meeting, casting some doubt as to whether he was pleased to receive President Lee from South Korea, the meeting itself, by all accounts, went very well. So I think this is a victory of sorts for all 3 nations, that is South Korea, the United States, and Japan. And Mr. Lee, President Lee, did a good job.
Robert, how do you look at the visit, especially to Washington? Of course, they had a back and forth meeting inside the White House.
Yeah, I think that previous assessment was basically correct. In part, I think it's because expectations were pretty low. I think now, after 7 months of Donald Trump's second term, we all realize that Trump's summits and meetings, especially when they're on television, are going to be these sort of strange affairs. The president is prone to sort of talk about all kinds of bizarre things and wander into strange issues and stuff. You saw that with that Truth Social tweet this morning that really nobody here understands. Nobody really quite knows what that's about. We all remember what it was like with Zelensky, where things really went off the rails and they were shouting at each other on television. And so I think the fact that you didn't have anything like that it went off reasonably well. I mean, they shook hands and were smiling and looked like they were getting along. It's pretty low bar, I think, for most American presidents. But for Trump, I think that's where we are. And I think that's really what people were looking for here in South Korea. I don't think you're going to get too much clarity on the major issues in one summit. That Trump doesn't operate that way. Those details will come later. But I think for what it was supposed to be coming out, again, as your previous guest mentioned, I think it was pretty successful, yes.
Details coming up later. Anna, of course, one of the issue we know that the 2 sides, discussed, or they will discuss further probably, about the U.S. military presence in South Korea, and the concern from the Korean side seems to be reduced U.S. military presence. What's going on between the 2 sides there?
Well, first off, I'm going to have to disagree with my colleagues here. I think it was the usual, yes, low bar, but it was bizarre. That tweet there was basically a recognition that Donald Trump felt he was slighted because, he went to Japan first. And this doesn't play well with the king. He has to be first and foremost. So that was quite clear. This bizarre thing of give us the land. I don't know what that means. It's very transactional, very Trump. Surprised he didn't look at his watch and say, hey, that's a nice watch, why don't you give it to me? But I mean, in terms of the troops, he's playing a game. He's also pressing South Korea in terms of what are you going to do if there's an attack on Taiwan? all right, or if we go to war with Taiwan. And he's done this with Japan, he's done this with Australia, but he's playing this cutesy game. This is all about putting pressure on China, and unfortunately I didn't think the smiles looked very genuine. So I'm going to put this as, yes, it wasn't a Zelensky bad moment, but it certainly was not a vote of confidence, and where Koreans, I'm half Korean, feel that this was a victory of any sort.
Well, Mr. Lee, let's focus a little bit on the visit to Japan. Always there's a break of tradition of visiting the U.S. first for new president from South Korea. What is the consideration behind the decision?
Well, when you look at the map, Japan is sort of en route to the United States, flying across the Pacific. Of course, President Lee took a chance in visiting Japan before the United States, but he tried to downplay it. That is, not to read too much into it. It was just one of those things, an itinerary that just fell into place. And I think Trump, I slightly disagree with our guest. I don't think Trump was necessarily annoyed at Lee's decision to meet with the Japanese leader before the king, before President Trump himself.
Okay.
But what President Trump has shown over the past 3 months or so since Lee's election is a bit of displeasure toward Lee himself, because in the past, we know that President Lee has said very unkind things about Japan, has also downplayed the role of the United States in liberating the Korean Peninsula in 1945, and even inserted a bizarre paragraph in the first impeachment motion against the former, now disgraced President Yoon Sung-yeol in the first impeachment motion in December last year, that Yoon Sung-yeol is responsible for South Korea really bending backwards to please the United States, and this weird policy, pursuing this weird policy of pro-Japanese and anti-China, anti-North Korea, and anti-Russia policy. So we know Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, were not very pleased with that. And there was this pervasive view that Mr. Lee was too pro-China, too pro-Russia and North Korea, and slightly anti-Japan and even perhaps the United States. So for now, I think those biases or true feelings have been assuaged. But, it's a long process. One good summit meeting, one not disastrous summit meeting does not spell a rosy path forward over the next 4 or 5 years. We've seen that in the past. Japan-South Korea relations are quite brittle. And of course, we've had some low moments in US-South Korea relations as well. So this is merely the beginning.
Einar, you were shaking your head?
Yeah, I mean, how can we be sitting here talking about the heads of states meeting and putting the bar so low that, he didn't shout at each other? That's really not good. I mean, the elephant in the room is that Donald Trump is a bully. And he is attempting to do a number of things here. And a lot of it has to do with China. It has very little to do with South Korea. You see, South Korea is a pawn in his game. So what does he talk about? Oh, I want to go see, Kim. I mean, it's bizarre. They're holding, Kim has issued his displeasure over the fact that they're having joint military exercises right now, which he says are a direct threat to the takeover of North Korea. It's bizarre. That's the only way you can put it. It's disjointed, and it's leading to a lot of people to question what is in Donald Trump's mind. It seems to be more about distracting people from Epstein than it is about the substance of what he's doing.
Robert, so what's in Trump's mind? Obviously, he's applying tariff on South Korea, indiscriminately, let's say. And also he's talking about requests for the land ownership there. It seems like he's been creating pressure on the new administration in Seoul. I mean, what's the purpose?
Yeah, what's in Trump's mind? I think we've all been spending 10 years trying to figure that one out. I don't know. Honestly, I think cognitively, I think he's kind of a mess. He wakes up, he watches Fox, he looks on Twitter, He sees something, and that's what he talks about for the day. I really don't think it's any more conspiratorial than that, to be blunt. I think he sort of understands the basics of the office require him to meet foreign leaders, that U.S. allies particularly expect some kind of FaceTime, and he has to go through the motions with these things. I don't think he particularly cares or prepares for them particularly well, right? It's pretty clear in the South Korean case, for example, he just doesn't care about the fact that there's an extant treaty regulating South Korea-U.S. trade, right? The Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, KORS, is signed and ratified. It's black letter law, as the lawyers would say, and Trump just ignored it and slapped on his tariffs. I don't think Trump thinks very much about South Korea. I don't think he cares about it particularly much. I think he probably woke up in the last couple of days or two and somebody put a book in front of him and said, here are 5 things you need to know because you got to meet this guy in a couple of days, right? We know Trump is a real estate developer, so the idea that America is leasing land from Korea strikes him as upsetting. Trump has this deep-seated belief that U.S. allies are scamming the United States, they're ripping us off, right? And so the idea that South Korea should give us something in exchange for U.S. forces here, that's established Trumpian thinking going back. I think the only sort of quirk of it is traditionally Trump has interpreted that impulse as a cash handout. That's how you've seen him address the Europeans. But in Korea, because of the bases, there's one particularly I think that he's thinking of that's quite large. He's stumbled on this idea. I don't know where he got it from, maybe Laura Loomer or something on the internet, but he stumbled on this idea that we should own it. That's probably not going to go anywhere. I imagine South Korean legislature would blast
developer mentality, maybe. Yeah, but Robert, anyway, what about the expansion of the U.S. military Korea, purpose, like to not only targeting North Korea but also China? Is this the idea from Trump or the idea from the Pentagon?
No, I think it's generally coming from the American national community, just sort of generally, right? I think the U.S. foreign policy community has become significantly more hawkish about China in the last 10 years. You and I have discussed this many times on this program. I think that's pretty widely accepted, right? Why exactly is up for debate. I get it. Some people say it's because of Xi Jinping, whatever, right? But I think that you see this move. And so in the Korean case, what that means is the American alliance, which is something nice for South Korea. It's a world-class security guarantee against North Korea. That should come with some kind of quid pro quo for the Americans, which is assistance on China and Taiwan issues. Now, I think South Korean conservatives, the previous president, I think they were pretty comfortable with that deal, but I think South Korean progressives are really uncomfortable with it. And I think you saw that kind of language from President Lee in the run-up to this meeting in the last couple of weeks. And I think this is a big issue on the South Korean left, and it's not clear to me how they'll come down.
Well, Mr. Lee, what kind of a challenge do you think President Trump present to South Korea? Tariff, military presence, of course, expanded mission targeting China, etc.
Clearly a present and long-term challenge across spectrums. That land ownership comment, it just came out of nowhere. And as Professor Kelly mentioned, yes, Mr. Trump has shown an impulse for land acquisition. He's spoken of taking over Greenland, Canada, Gaza, the Panama Canal, and so on. So in that vein, I suppose it shouldn't be all that surprising, but it was kind of shocking and inappropriate because legally speaking, it's an impossibility. According to the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea of 1953, Article 4 states quite clearly that South Korea is granting the U.S. access to its territory under an agreement, and that the U.S. accepts this temporary arrangement. And then there's the Status of Forces Agreement, Article 2 and 3, that clearly state that the U.S. does not have legal, it's not U.S. property, it's South Korean territory. So Trump's not going to get anywhere with this. But just by mentioning it, I think his negotiating tactic is try to disrupt or rattle his adversary or his partner and to gain the momentum and upper hand in negotiating a host of factors. So President Trump, it seems, spent considerable time talking about how he wants to meet with Kim Jong-un. And I don't think that's an impossibility either. For now, Kim Jong-un may just enjoy being courted by both leaders, Trump and Lee. But in time, he may consent to meeting with Trump, and who knows, maybe President Lee himself. South Korea is hosting, as you know, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in late October, just 2 months or so from now. And who knows, maybe Trump might stop by Pyongyang on his way to South Korea, to Gyeongju, the way that a young Vladimir Putin did in July 2000 when he stopped by Pyongyang, becoming the first ever top Russian or former Soviet leader to visit Pyongyang and meeting with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, and then taking this weird message that Kim Jong-il had conveyed to Putin to Okinawa for the G8 summit, with Bill Clinton there as well, saying that Kim Jong-il said that his nation's ballistic missile program is purely for peaceful purposes of launching satellites, and they don't have that technology yet. But if Russia or China, or even if the United States would help North Korea, then Kim Jong-il is perfectly fine with bidding adieu, goodbye to his ballistic missile program, which is disingenuous, of course, but Putin became the darling, the spotlight there for that short minute or day. And Trump, if he were to meet Kim before coming to South Korea, if that were to take place in Pyongyang, then Trump would be the star of the show, and he craves spotlight. So we'll see. But I think in time, Kim Jong-un would be amenable to meeting with Trump. There are many advantages to be gained.
Before we shift the focus a little bit to North Korea, let's say, people imagine there's a pressure on South Korea because the U.S. policy to contain China, U.S. wants South Korea to side with the U.S. more, to increase defense spending, to reduce probably trade relationship with China. I mean, how will the President Lee, manage or balance this relationship between Beijing and Washington? Mr. Lee, please. Yeah.
Well, it's a long-term task, and there will be ups and downs, as there have been in the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo over the decades, and also moments of friction and prolonged, awkward sort of standoff between South Korea and the United States in the past, notably in 2005, when the then South Korean President Roh Moo-hyun declared that his nation, South Korea, will henceforth pursue a policy of equidistance vis-a-vis the United States and China, becoming the balancer in the region. And senior American officials, many scoffed at the notion, many were irritated. One former ambassador to South Korea said a shrimp cannot balance two whales, or something like that. So there will be ups and downs in the bilateral relationship. But for now, from reading the South Korean press, while the opposition party is not so kind on evaluating the Trump-Lee summit, I think the majority of the South Korean population are just breathing a sigh of relief that it didn't end in a disaster. And the mood, the atmospherics were warm and jovial. And that counts in Korean politics for a day or two.
Will Anna, take a look at the relationship between the Koreas here. And in terms of that, let me quote here. President Lee said to Donald Trump at the White House, quote, "I look forward to your meeting with the chairman Kim Jong-un of North Korea and the construction of a Trump Tower in North Korea and playing golf at that place," end quote. What's the expectation?
Well, I think there is a double meaning there. One, it's mission impossible. But second, it kind of plays to Trump's vanity that he can somehow do it. I don't put any stock in it, and this is the reason why. The people I've talked to who are close to North Korea have made it very clear. Kim Jong-un felt humiliated by Donald Trump going down there and saying, "What are you offering?" And Donald Trump said, "You get rid of your nukes." And there was nothing on the table. Really doubtful he would set himself up here. Now, he does have every reason to meet with the U.S. and South Korea, but it has to be somebody he has some faith in. And the reason I say that is by saying he does not want a united Korea, he's in essence setting himself up for peace negotiations in terms of trying to figure out where the boundaries are, and then he can be, quote, normalized. He's had some daylight with Russia. He's being a lot of attention on interviewing commanders and showing movies of North Korean troops in Ukraine. So I think he's trying to get attention. And I think the attention he's want is really, on his plate right now. He has the nukes. Now he wants to normalize the relationship, set boundaries, and be an independent country.
Robert, what do you think of this relationship between the North and the South? Of course, involving the U.S. side. Are we going to see like a strained relationship, or are we going to see somehow the relationship will be, let's say, less strained and less tension, and somehow maybe meetings between leaders?
Right. Well, traditionally, when the South Korean left holds the presidency, the relations tend to soften because the South Korean left, the progressives, are interested in détente. You've heard that kind of language from this president as well. I think he genuinely wants to reach out to North Korea. There's always interest in joint projects that runs into sanctions. That's a whole tangly issue that we had last time there was a progressive president. What's really noticeable this time is that the North Koreans just don't want to talk to this progressive president at all. I mean, the rejections have been pretty blunt and pretty sharp. It's not really clear to me why that's so. If I had to guess, it's because North Korea's got a good patron now in Russia and doesn't feel that it needs to talk to South Korea or be accommodating at all. Although, again, I don't think it's entirely clear. I think that's one of the reasons why Lee Jae-myung mentioned Donald Trump speaking to North Korea, because the South Koreans have had no luck with that. Perhaps Trump can do it. Trump speaks to the United States. Having a summit between North Korea and a superpower is always attractive for North Korea, if only for the optics. But as your other guest mentioned, Donald Trump didn't bring anything last time except a demand, right? And so it's not really clear to me that the North Koreans are going to show up to go through the sort of circus that they had last time. I mean, I just don't see that happening, perhaps, if only for the television. But I would imagine that anything that happens this time would have to be accompanied by meaningful offers and meaningful back and forth. And Trump is just not good at that. So even if there's a summit, nothing will come of it. I think that's an easy prediction.
Well, Mr. Lee, President Lee's policy on the North obviously is very different from his predecessor, which pursued a hardline policy on North Korea. So are we expecting different outcome in terms of relationship with North Korea?
Before I address that directly, that difficult question, there are two constants in South Korean politics with respect to foreign policy. Two facts that are unchanging, immutable, really. One is if you play the anti-Japan card, your ratings go up. And going back to 2005, President Roh Moo-hyun, on the occasion of the centennial 100th year anniversary of Japan's acquisition of Dokdo in Korean and Takeshima in Japanese, when Shimane Prefecture declared February 22nd to be Takeshima Day, the South Korean president said that Japan is denying history and we cannot allow Japan to return to pursuit of hegemonic power. We are virtually on the verge of a diplomatic war with Japan. When he made that utterance, his ratings went from 20% to 48% in 5 days. The other immutable fact is, well, if the South Korean leader shakes hands with the North Korean leader, his ratings go through the roof. 80%, over 80%. That's what we saw in 2018 when former President Moon Jae-in met with Kim Jong-un for the first time at Panmunjom at the border village on April 27, 2018. So, yes, Mr. Lee, from a political point of view, President Lee has a very big reason, compelling motivation to meet with Kim Jong-un for domestic scoring political points at home. And he may have also, he may harbor illusions of finally denuclearizing North Korea. But in my view, any future summit meetings between Kim and Trump or Kim and Lee will not only not lead to North Korea's denuclearization, but more likely it will cement the pariah nation's status as a nuclear power. And I think President Trump is amenable to recognizing that reality and giving up on trying to denuclearize North Korea and resort to damage control, that is, engage North Korea in disarmament talks. That is jarring for many South Koreans, but I think we are headed in that direction.
If that's true, then what will be next? Is that, how difficult that would be? Is that possible, to say disarmament after recognizing North Korea as a nuclear power? Which is a fact now, whether you officially recognize that or not. Despite the existence of difference, between different practices, but still that's the fact. Is that possible? Let's say South Korea also recognize that kind of fact officially and then start there to do something, to lower down the tension probably and to improve relationship?
Well, it is a fact, yes. North Korea has maybe 50 nuclear bombs or more, perhaps even close to 100, we don't know. But North Korea has been a veritable nuclear power and does not really need to conduct another nuclear test to prove its nuclear status. So when we recognize that sobering reality, engaging North Korea in arms control, threat reduction talks, makes sense to many Americans and perhaps some South Koreans as well. So I think we are headed in that direction, and that's an advantage for North Korea. And there's plenty of blame to go around as to why the 30-year-old attempt to negotiate with North Korea and disarm North Korea's didn't work. There's plenty of blame to go around for everyone, but that is the sobering reality. So from a ruthlessly rational point of view, engaging Kim Jong-un and not harboring the illusion that he's going to say bye-bye to his nukes, but engaging Kim for disarmament or partial disarmament, arms control talks, that is in the best interest of all nations concerned.
Yes, let's take a look at South Korea-U.S. Trade relationship, Anna. South Korea has significantly increased its investments in key U.S. sectors such as semiconductors, EVs, and batteries, of course, with the purpose to, at least partly, to mitigate the impact of U.S. tariff policies and to smooth the ties with Trump. How do you think this will work on Trump in terms of bilateral ties here?
Well, everybody knows what you do is you smile, shake hands, laugh at his jokes, and then promise a big number. The fact is that Donald Trump hasn't followed through on the big numbers from his first presidency. If you remember back then, I was chairman of the state of Wisconsin's International Trade Council, not at that point, but just passed. And Terry Goose showed up and said, I'm going to make a big factory, 13,000 jobs, high tech is coming to the Midwest. Well, right now there's a couple hundred jobs, very little to do with high tech, and it fell flat. The billions of dollars that he promised, that Trump said would be flowing in and that this was the start, hasn't happened. Does he care? No. He just wants the optics of the moment. As my guess, as my colleague said, Donald Trump, he wakes up in the morning, thinks of whatever's going on, and then, right, let's run with that. And he's confirmed that in his memoirs. He says, I live day by day. I try to maximize my day. I don't think about tomorrow, and I don't think about yesterday. But I think there's one thing that we have to consider. My other colleague talked about disarmament. I think it's far more likely that you're going to see a push towards having their own nuclear weapons in South Korea. The public favors it, with the U.S. being so difficult about the relationship. I think not necessarily this president, but in Korean politics, it tends to swing. The pendulum goes back and forth. I think the next one who comes in will say, look, we need to be on our own basis. We can't rely on the U.S. We have to have our own defense.
Well, obviously, we'll keep an eye on that development, possible development, let's say. On that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.